They don't pay taxes. They influence elections. They shape laws. They control billions in assets. They operate outside the rules that govern everyone else. And you gave them that power. Not directly, not intentionally, but through a legal loophole created decades ago that has since become one of the most profitable exemptions in American history. I'm talking about churches and the political empire they've built while you weren't paying attention. Lopers, welcome to Solway. Over the next 18 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how religious organizations went from houses of worship to political machines, how they amassed wealth that rivals Fortune 500 companies, how they influence your government while paying zero taxes, and how one amendment, just one, changed everything. This isn't about attacking faith. This is about following the money and the power, because what I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about the separation of church and state. If you value investigations that expose hidden power structures, subscribe to Solway right now. Hit that notification bell, because this goes deeper than you can imagine. Let me start with a simple question. Why don't churches pay taxes? Most people assume it's always been this way, that the founding fathers intended churches to be tax exempt, that it's part of religious freedom. Wrong. The modern tax exemption for churches was not codified until 1954, and it had nothing to do with religious freedom. It was politics, pure politics. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back further, to 1913 when the 16th Amendment established federal income tax. When Congress created the tax code, they included exemptions for certain organizations, educational institutions, charitable organizations, and yes, religious institutions. But here's what's crucial. The exemption came with a condition. These organizations had to be nonprofit and serve public good. They couldn't accumulate wealth for private benefit, they couldn't engage in substantial business activities, and they absolutely could not participate in political campaigns. For decades, this worked reasonably well. Churches were small, local, community-focused. They provided genuine charitable services. They stayed out of politics. Then everything changed. In 1954, a young senator named Lyndon B. Johnson proposed an amendment, not because he cared about religious neutrality, because he was being attacked. Two nonprofit organizations in Texas were campaigning against him. They were distributing literature, funding his opponents, actively working to defeat him. Let me tell you about a church in Ohio that decided an election. In 2004, the presidential race between George W. Bush and John Kerry came down to one state, Ohio. Win Ohio, win the presidency. In the weeks before the election, churches across Ohio distributed millions of voter guides. They weren't officially endorsing candidates. That would violate the Johnson Amendment. But these guides were rated candidates on issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and gun rights. One side got all the favorable ratings, one side got all the unfavorable ones. Pastors preached about the importance of voting Christian values. Churches organized buses to polling places. Some churches made voting a religious duty. Bush won Ohio by 118,000 votes. Exit polls showed white evangelical Christians broke for Bush at 80%. Their turnout was unprecedented. Karl Rove, Bush's chief strategist, later admitted, the evangelical mobilization in Ohio was the key to victory. A tax-exempt religious mobilization decided who became president. This wasn't an accident. This was strategy, and it's happened in every election since. Let me show you how the machine works. It starts with the megachurch. These aren't your grandmother's churches. These are operations with budgets in the tens or hundreds of millions. Multiple campuses, media empires, political connections. Take Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas. Pastor John Hagee leads Christians United for Israel, a lobbying organization with over 10 million members. He has direct access to presidents, senators, foreign leaders. When Hagee speaks, politicians listen, because he can deliver votes. In 2015, Hagee hosted a presidential candidate forum. Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, they all came to his church to court evangelical voters. This is a tax-exempt organization hosting what amounts to a political primary. Or look at First Baptist Church Dallas. Pastor Robert Jeffress has been a vocal Trump supporter. He's spoken at political rallies. He's on Fox News constantly. He frames political issues in spiritual terms. Vote Republican or you're voting against God. His church remains tax-exempt. Liberty University in Virginia isn't technically a church, but it's a Christian institution with tax-exempt status. Former President Jerry Falwell Jr. turned it into a Republican political machine. In 2016, Falwell endorsed Trump and delivered the evangelical student vote. Liberty became a required stop for Republican candidates. Then, in 2020, Falwell was caught in a sex scandal involving his wife and a pool boy. He resigned in disgrace. But Liberty's political influence remains unchanged, because it was never about moral leadership. It was about political power. Now let me tell you about the most powerful political church organization most people have never heard of, the Council for National Policy. Founded in 1981 by Paul Weyrich and Tim LaHaye, The CNP is a secretive organization that brings together conservative religious leaders, politicians, and wealthy donors. Members have included James Dobson, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Phyllis Schlafly, Oliver North, Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, and Mike Pence. They meet 3 times a year. Meetings are completely closed to media. Attendees are forbidden from discussing what happens. But leaked audio from a 2020 meeting revealed their strategies: how to mobilize churches for political action, how to frame issues in religious terms, how to deliver voting blocks. This is tax-exempt religious organizing functioning as a political strategy session. And it's perfectly legal because nobody enforces the rules. But churches don't just influence elections, they write legislation. Let me give you a specific example. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Sounds good, right? Protecting religious freedom? Here's what it actually does. It allows individuals and organizations to claim religious exemption from laws they disagree with. Don't want to provide birth control to employees? Hobby Lobby claimed religious exemption and won at the Supreme Court. Don't want to serve LGBTQ customers? Religious exemption. Don't want to follow anti-discrimination laws? Religious exemption. Who drafted this legislation? Religious lobbying organizations. Who pushed it through? Churches mobilizing their congregations. Who benefits? Religious institutions operating outside the rules everyone else follows. This is theocracy disguised as religious freedom, and it's accelerating. In states across America, churches are pushing heartbeat bills banning abortion as early as 6 weeks. They're pushing legislation allowing adoption agencies to refuse same-sex couples. They're pushing laws requiring religious curriculum in public schools. These aren't grassroots movements. These are coordinated campaigns by church-funded organizations. The Alliance Defending Freedom, a Christian legal organization, coordinates most of these efforts. Annual budget, over $65 million. Tax-exempt. They've been designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center for their anti-LGBTQ work, but they're tax-exempt because they're a religious organization. Let me tell you about the Seven Mountains Mandate. This is a theology that's becoming increasingly popular in evangelical circles. The idea: Christians must gain dominion over 7 spheres of society: religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. Not influence, dominion, control. This isn't fringe anymore. Members of Congress openly embrace this theology. Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, others, they explicitly talk about taking dominion. These are elected officials who believe their religious mission is to control government. And the churches promoting this theology? Tax-exempt. Now let me show you the international dimension. Because American churches don't just influence American politics. American evangelical organizations have spent hundreds of millions funding anti-LGBTQ legislation in Africa. Uganda's Kill the Gays bill, legislation that would impose the death penalty for homosexuality, was heavily influenced by American evangelical missionaries. Scott Lively, an American pastor, gave speeches in Uganda calling homosexuality a threat that would destroy their culture. His organization is tax-exempt. When the legislation passed, he denied responsibility. But the evidence is clear. American churches, with tax-exempt status, funded campaigns that resulted in legislation authorizing execution of people for their sexuality. This is American tax subsidy funding human rights violations abroad. But here's what might be most shocking: the Catholic Church's political influence. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is one of the most powerful lobbying organizations in America. They lobby on abortion, contraception, same-sex marriage, healthcare, immigration, everything. Annual lobbying budget, tens of millions of dollars, tax-exempt. When the Affordable Care Act was being debated, the Catholic bishops lobbied intensely to exclude contraception coverage. They partially succeeded. Religious employers got exemptions. When states try to extend statutes of limitations for child sex abuse cases, Catholic dioceses lobby against it because it would expose them to liability for decades of cover-ups. They spend tax-exempt money to protect themselves from accountability for abuse. In 2020, Catholic dioceses received over $3 billion in COVID relief funds from the Paycheck Protection Program. Meanwhile, they were paying out billions in sex abuse settlements, tax-exempt money, federal bailout money, and zero accountability. But here's the question nobody asks. Why? Why do we give religious organizations these exemptions? Why do we allow political activity we prohibit for every other tax-exempt organization? The answer is both simple and disturbing: because they're powerful, because they're organized, because challenging them is political suicide. No politician wants to be accused of attacking religion. No political party wants to lose the religious vote. So everyone pretends the emperor has clothes. Everyone pretends churches aren't political machines. Everyone pretends the separation of church and state still exists. But it doesn't. It hasn't for decades. We have theocracy disguised as democracy. Political power subsidized by taxpayers. and an entire system designed to avoid accountability. In part 3, I'm going to show you exactly how much power churches have accumulated, the Supreme Court justices who rule in their favor, the legislation they've passed, the rights they've taken away, and what it means for the future of American democracy. Are you angry yet? You should be. Comment below and let me know. Because part 3 is where we confront what this actually means. June 24th, 2022. The Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade and Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. Abortion, legal nationwide for 50 years, is suddenly left to individual states. Within hours, trigger laws in multiple states ban abortion immediately. This wasn't a legal decision. This was the culmination of a 50-year religious campaign. Let me show you exactly how churches made this happen. After Roe v. Wade in 1973, religious organizations, particularly the Catholic Church and evangelical denominations, made overturning it their singular mission. They built a legal infrastructure. The Federalist Society, founded in 1982, trained conservative lawyers and judges specifically to reshape the judiciary. They built a political strategy. Make abortion, the wedge issue that delivers single-issue voters. They built a judicial pipeline. Identify, fund, and promote judges who would rule favorably on religious issues. It took 50 years, but it worked. The 6 conservative justices who voted to overturn Roe, 5 are Catholic and 1 is evangelical. All were vetted by the Federalist Society. This is what religious political power looks like. Decades-long strategy, billions in funding, control of the judiciary, and it's tax-exempt. But abortion is just the beginning, because now that they've proven the strategy works, they're coming for everything else. Justice Clarence Thomas, in his concurring opinion in Dobbs, explicitly stated that the court should reconsider Griswold versus Connecticut, contraception rights, Lawrence versus Texas, consensual same-sex activity, and Obergefell versus Hodges, same-sex marriage. He listed them by name as targets. This is the roadmap, and churches are mobilizing to make it happen. Let me show you what's already happening at the state level. In Texas, churches helped pass SB 8, the law that bans abortion at 6 weeks and allows private citizens to sue anyone who helps someone get an abortion. This creates vigilante enforcement of religious moral codes. In Florida, churches backed the Do and Say Gay bill, legislation prohibiting classroom discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grades. In Tennessee, churches pushed legislation allowing adoption agencies to refuse same-sex couples. In Oklahoma, churches are pushing legislation requiring the 10 Commandments be displayed in every classroom. This is happening in dozens of states simultaneously, coordinated, funded, organized, and it's accelerating. But here's what's even more disturbing. Christian nationalism is becoming mainstream. Christian nationalism is the belief that America is fundamentally a Christian nation and should be governed by Christian principles, not influence, governance. A 2023 survey found that more than half of Republicans support declaring America a Christian nation, not metaphorically, legally. Elected officials now openly advocate Christian nationalism. Lauren Boebert said, "The church is supposed to direct the government." Marjorie Taylor Greene calls herself a Christian nationalist proudly. These aren't fringe voices. These are members of Congress, and their agenda is clear. They want Christian law to supersede secular law. Let me give you a specific example of what this looks like. In Louisiana, churches successfully lobbied to require the 10 Commandments be posted in every public school classroom. This is government-mandated religious display. It violates the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Multiple lawsuits have been filed. But here's the strategy. They're counting on the current Supreme Court to uphold it, to further erode the wall between church and state. And given the court's composition, they might be right. The Supreme Court has become increasingly favorable to religious claims. In recent years, they ruled that a football coach has the right to pray on the field after games, even though it coerces student participation. They ruled that states must fund religious schools equally with secular schools, effectively mandating taxpayer funding of religious education. They ruled that religious employers can discriminate in hiring based on religious criteria, even for non-religious positions. Each decision chips away at secular governance. Each decision expands religious privilege. This is the theocratic creep. Slow, methodical, strategic. Now let me talk about money in a different way. Not church wealth, but church political spending. In 2020, churches and religious organizations spent over $500 million on political lobbying. This is just what's reported. Much more happens through issue advocacy that doesn't require disclosure. For comparison, the NRA, one of the most powerful lobbies, spent about $250 million. Religious organizations outspent the gun lobby 2-1. And unlike the NRA, they pay zero taxes on the money they use for political purposes. Here's how the scheme works. A church receives tax-exempt donations. They create an affiliated nonprofit, also tax-exempt, that does issue advocacy. That nonprofit creates a PAC, technically not tax exempt, but can accept unlimited donations. The PAC spends on political campaigns. Money flows from tax-exempt entities to political campaigns through this laundering pipeline. It's legal, barely, but it means taxpayers subsidize political campaigns through religious tax exemptions. Now, let me address the question you might be asking. What about progressive churches? Liberal denominations? Don't they also get these exemptions? Yes, they do. And some engage in political activity too, but there's a critical difference in scale and coordination. Conservative, evangelical, and Catholic political organizing dwarfs progressive religious organizing by orders of magnitude. The funding, the infrastructure, the coordination, it's not comparable. And frankly, that's the point. The system benefits those who exploit it most aggressively, and conservative religious organizations have been far more aggressive. So where does this end? If current trends continue, we're heading toward explicit theocracy, not metaphorical, actual religious governance. We're talking about mandatory religious education in public schools, taxpayer funding of religious institutions without restriction, religious exemptions from virtually all secular law, government enforcement of religious moral codes, Supreme Court that views any limit on religious practice as unconstitutional. This isn't speculation. This is the stated agenda of Christian nationalist organizations, and they're winning. So what can be done? First, enforcement. The IRS needs to actually enforce the Johnson Amendment. Churches that engage in political campaigning should lose tax-exempt status, period. Second, transparency. Religious organizations should be required to disclose finances like every other tax-exempt organization. If you want taxpayer subsidy, you provide accountability. Third, limits. Religious exemptions should be narrow and specific, not blanket permission to ignore laws. Fourth, education. People need to understand what's happening, the slow erosion of secular democracy, the building theocratic infrastructure. Fifth, political will. Elect officials who will defend secular governance, who will resist religious encroachment, who will enforce actual separation of church and state. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This probably won't happen. Because churches are too powerful, too organized, too politically entrenched. Because no politician wants to lose the religious vote. Because Americans have been conditioned to see any challenge to religious privilege as persecution, so the theocratic creep will likely continue, slowly, methodically, until one day people wake up and realize they live in a country where religious law supersedes secular law, where your rights depend on whether they align with someone else's religious beliefs, where democracy has been replaced by theocracy. And it all happened legally, through tax exemptions, through political organizing, through judicial appointments, through power you gave them without realizing it. Let me end with this. I'm not against religion, I'm not against faith, I'm not against churches doing genuine charitable work and providing spiritual community, but I am against theocracy. I am against religious organizations having political power without accountability. I am against taxpayer subsidy of political campaigns. I am against erosion of secular democracy. If you're religious, you should be too. Because theocracy doesn't just threaten non-believers, it threatens everyone who doesn't subscribe to the specific theology in power. Today, it might be your theology. Tomorrow, it might not be. And then you'll understand why separation of church and state protects everyone. The question isn't whether you're religious. The question is whether you believe in democracy. Can you have both religious freedom and democratic governance? Yes, but only if religious organizations stay out of politics. Only if churches focus on spiritual matters, not political power. We're far from that reality now, and we're moving further every day. Thank you for staying through this entire investigation. If this opened your eyes, if this made you uncomfortable, if this made you think, good. That's the point. Subscribe to Soulway for more deep dives into power structures that shape your life. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's happening. And most importantly, comment below. Tell me what you think. Are you concerned? Do you think I'm overreacting? Do you have experience with political churches? Your voice matters, your vote matters, your awareness matters. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep defending democracy, because nobody else will do it for you. The theocrats are counting on your ignorance and your apathy. Don't give them either.